Outside of medicine and the army, favored terrains of simulation, the affair goes back to religion and the simulacrum of divinity. I forbade any simulacrum in the temples because the divinity that breathes life into nature cannot be represented. Indeed, it can. But what becomes of the divinity when it reveals itself in icons, when it is multiplied in simulacra? Does it remain the supreme authority, simply incarnated in images as a visible theology? Or is it volatilized into simulacra which alone deploy their pomp and power of fascination, the visual machinery of icons being substituted for the pure and intelligible idea of God? This is precisely what was feared by the Iconoclasts, whose millennial quarrel is still with us today. Their rage to destroy images rose precisely because they sensed this omnipotence of simulacra, this facility they have of erasing God from the consciousness of people, and the overwhelming destructive truth which they suggest, that ultimately there has never been any God, that only simulacra exist, indeed that God himself has only ever been his own simulacrum. Had they been able to believe that images only occulted or masked the Platonic idea of God, there would have been no reason to destroy them. One can live with the idea of a distorted truth, but their metaphysical despair came from the idea that the images concealed nothing at all, and that in fact they were not images, such as the original model had made them, but actually perfect simulacra forever radiant with their own fascination. But this death of the divine referential has to be exorcised at all cost. It could be seen that the iconoclasts, who are often accused of despising and denying images, were in fact the ones who accorded them their actual worth, unlike the iconoladders, who saw in them only reflections and were content to venerate God at one remove. But the converse can also be said, namely that the iconoladders possess the most modern and adventurous minds, since underneath the idea of the apparition of God in the mirror of images, they already enacted his death and his disappearance in the epiphany of his representations, which they perhaps knew no longer represented anything and that they were purely a game, but that this was precisely the greatest game, knowing also that it is dangerous to unmask images, since they dissimulate the fact that there is nothing behind them. This was the approach of the Jesuits, who based their politics on the virtual disappearance of God and on the worldly and spectacular manipulation of consciousness, the effervescence of God and the epiphany of power, the end of transcendence, which no longer serves as an alibi for a strategy completely free of influence and signs. Behind the baroque of images hides the gray eminence of politics. Thus, perhaps at stake has always been the murderous capacity of images, murderers of the real, murderers of their own model as the Byzantine icons could murder the divine entity. To this murderous capacity is opposed the dialectical capacity of representations as a visible and intelligible mediation of the real. All of Western faith and good faith was engaged in this wager on representation, that a sign could refer to the depth of meaning, that a sign could exchange for meaning, and that something could guarantee this exchange. God, of course. But what if God himself can be simulated, that is to say, reduced to the signs which attest his existence? Then the whole system becomes weightless. It is no longer anything but a gigantic simulacrum, not unreal, but a simulacrum, never again exchanging for what is real, but exchanging in itself, in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference. So it is with simulation insofar as it is opposed to representation. Representation starts from the principle that the sign and the real are equivalent. Conversely, simulation starts from the utopia of this principle of equivalence, from the radical negation of the signs as value, from the sign as reversion and death sentence of every reference. Whereas representation tries to absorb simulation by interpreting it as a false representation, simulation envelops the whole edifice of representation as itself a simulacrum. These would be the successive phases of the image. Number 1, it is the reflection of a basic reality. Number 2, it masks and perverts a basic reality. Number 3, it masks the absence of a basic reality. Number 4, it bears no relation to any reality whatever. It is its own pure simulacrum. In the first case, the image is a good appearance, The representation is of the order of the sacrament. In the second, it is an evil appearance, of the order of malefice. In the third, it plays at being an appearance. It is of the order of sorcery. In the fourth, it is no longer the order of appearance at all, but of simulation. The transition from signs which dissimulate something to signs which dissimulate that there is nothing marks the decisive turning point. The first implies a theology of truth and secrecy. The second inaugurates an age of simulacra and simulation, in which there is no longer any God to recognize his own, nor any last judgment to separate truth from false, the real from its artificial resurrection, since everything is already dead and risen in advance. When the real is no longer what it used to be, nostalgia assumes its full meaning. There is a proliferation of myths of origin and signs of reality, of second-hand truth, objectivity and authenticity. There is an escalation of the true, of the lived experience, a resurrection of the figurative where the object and substance have disappeared. There is a panic-stricken production of the real and the referential, above and parallel to the panic of material production. This is how simulation appears in the phase that concerns us, a strategy of the real, neo-real and hyper-real, whose universal double is a strategy of deterrence.